From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It was a cold November night. Not the sort of night when people want to hang around on a balcony. And by the early hours, there weren't many people out on the streets either. In fact, if it wasn't for the cameras at the headquarters of MI6, we might never have known what happened next. But at 2:24 a.m, they caught an image of a man pacing on a balcony on the other side of the Thames. Seconds later, he threw himself off, plunging down to his death. The investigation that followed uncovered a dubious web of characters: gangsters, the super-rich, and a victim who claimed he was the son of a dead Russian oligarch. But for the parents of the victim, Zac Brettler, the investigation raised more questions than it answered.
They felt that police were, at best, conspicuously lacking in curiosity about certain pieces of evidence and information, and one of them is this spreadsheet, which, I've seen how they examined it.
Over recent weeks, an investigation by the Sunday Times has uncovered evidence that had been missed, which raises questions about what really happened on the night Zac Brettler died.
What has occupied me and, of course, my reporting, and certainly Zac's parents since, is why the police failed to get to the bottom of what happened in the face of some very sinister and troubling pieces of evidence.
The story today: the mysterious death of Zac Brettler.
So, would you mind just reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
My name's Gabriel Pogrund. I am the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times.
Gabriel, you've been carrying out an investigation for some time now into a death of someone you knew. Just tell us very briefly what happened.
So the boy at the centre of this story is Zac Brettler, who died aged 19 on the 29th of November 2019. Obviously, I am a political/investigative reporter. I try to avoid using the first person pronoun in what I write.
Yeah.
But this was one story which was in some ways personal. But my brother was a childhood friend of Zac Brettler's. Zac was a baby-faced young man who grew up in Maida Vale in northwest London. His parents, Matthew and Rochelle. Dad is a successful financial services professional. His mum is a writer. And I do remember hearing that he had died. It was posted on my family WhatsApp. And I think we had all assumed that he had sadly taken his own life. And it was only in the course of researching and reporting on this story that we learned it was so much darker than that.
I mean, it must have been a shock to think he'd taken his own life, but what's actually happened, as you say, is sort of so much more complicated. How did you start to look into it? I mean, were you speaking to his parents?
The genesis of this all was the journalism of Patrick Radden Keefe, the storied investigative reporter of The New Yorker. A lot of people, when his story came out, were shocked that it took an American journalist to get his teeth sunk into the subject matter. And off the back of that, I contacted Zac's parents and said, listen, I will never be able to do a job as comprehensive as that. But one thing I do have, which The New Yorker doesn't, is contacts here and a bit of literacy in a way that law enforcement works and other strange little corners the British state work. So I said, if there are questions that you feel you still need to address, I would be pleased to help if I can. And that was what set in motion the reporting that I've been doing over the last couple of months.
And I mean, it is a really intriguing story. Just take us back to what we knew of it. What actually happened to the boy you knew as Zac Brettler?
So I suppose it's probably a criminally unimaginative word, but I think Zac had a pretty normal life. He loved football, loved cricket, went to good public schools in North London. There was probably a pivot point in his life when he didn't get into school near him, which his older brother had gone to, and for a number of reasons ended up going to a school called Mill Hill on the outskirts of North London. And it was there that he ended up fraternising with, I don't know if this is the demographic of the school in the main, but there's certainly a large number of Russian and Chinese and Nigerian kids, the children of plutocrats, members, you wouldn't say even the 0.01%. I mean, people from a wholly different universe who inhabit a different realm in terms of the lifestyle and values.
These are the global super rich.
Global super rich. But it seems like he was intoxicated by or influenced by the wealth of his peers and possibly wanted that kind of money for himself or wanted access to that world. But it certainly appears that he developed a complicated relationship with the truth, possibly in order to present a certain persona to his peers. And by the time he came to the end of his school days, he could have gone to university, but decided that he wanted to explore business and the world of deal making and investing. And I think really the sort of beginning of the story that culminates with his death is when he started telling people that he was the son of a dead Russian oligarch by the name of Zack Ismailov.
Wow. So this is a real departure from his normal life. At this point, he just chooses not to go to university, but to sort of start in the world of deals. What do we know about how he set about doing it, apart from telling people that he was the son of a dead Russian oligarch?
He started claiming that he was somebody who he wasn't. And it seems like part of why he did that was to open doors to which he wouldn't otherwise have had access. And we can get into the specifics, but the upshot of this fictitious alter ego he cultivated was that he fell into the orbit of two men. One was this guy, his name's Akbar Shamji. He's a son of Ugandan Indians who moved to the UK as refugees in the 70s, studied at Cambridge and had his own pretty complicated, we shall say, business career. He was pronounced bankrupt after attempting to build up a business in California. His website is full of claims which are very difficult to substantiate or verify. And by the time he met Zack through a contact at a Mayfair Gentlemen's Club, he was himself in some perilous financial state, having lost his money in a deal gone wrong. And the other man who Brettler meets through Shamji is a man by the name of Verinder Sharma, although he was nicknamed Indian Dave. And Indian Dave was a gangster and become involved in drug smuggling in the late 90s and early noughties. And his great claim to fame, or at least when you try and examine his life, one of the big things you learn about was that he was involved in the first assassination in the UK using an AK-47.
Wow.
He was the subject of this Interpol arrest warrant. For reasons that were never clarified, he was somehow able to come back to the UK. And by 2019, which is when he met Brettler, he was living in a luxury apartment complex called Riverwalk, just opposite MI6 headquarters, and had resumed his life of being an extortionist and loan shark.
Wow. So he's now living quite a luxury life on the Thames. And this is a fascinating world that Zac Brettler has sort of walked into. This is where you've got the super rich meeting the sort of slightly seedy underworld in the sort of luxurious, quite wealthy parts of London. They meet him and are told he's the son of a dead Russian oligarch. What happens next? What's the deal between the three?
So, according to what we've unravelled from police files, Zac had told Sharma and Shamji that he was embroiled in a dispute with his family, who were based in Dubai and who were arguing about what to do with the the recently deceased father's £6 billion estate. And it seems that Dave Sharma especially was of the view that Zac was going to regain access to his frozen bank account imminently, and in the course of so doing, gain access to hundreds of millions of pounds. And, to a degree that I've not been able to pin down, Shamji as well thought that if they helped Zac in the meantime, then maybe in due course they could get a cut of his money when it emerges. And Dave laid claim to, I think it was 5% of this fictitious fortune. And the preamble to Zac's death is characterized by this sense of growing anger and lack of patience from Dave about this money, which he believed, I'm owed now.
Right. So this has been a few months now.
They've known each other a few months, and Dave is basically saying, I want my money. And there are these menacing texts that he sends to Shamji saying, fuck this little kid. He can't just take. Doesn't he know what we've done for him? And, in his words, this has got to be resolved, and he cannot just run away now.
And that's after just 4 weeks of living in his apartment by the river. They feel they're due a payday.
It was not clear whether Zac overtly promised him this money or whether he laid claim to it, but he was getting very angry and was certainly conveying this sense of anger to Shamji and to Zac in the days before Zac's death.
And tell us about that. Take us to November 2019. As you say, Dave Sharma is getting very angry. He's been very close. He thinks he's been very generous to Zac up until then. What happens?
So, actually, on the 26th of November, Akbar Shamji flies to Turkey on a business trip. And less than 24 hours after arriving, he's on the plane back to Heathrow. And he's on his way back because there's a crisis growing back in London. It seems has realised that things are coming to a head between Zac and Indian Dave, and he can't evade it anymore. He essentially came back with Sharma demanding a meeting with Zac. The following day, spends the morning and afternoon with Zac, and that evening, Zac and Shamji head to Indian Dave's property, and it ends up being Zac's last night alive.
What do we know about what happens once they arrive at the property? This is now the evening of November the 28th, 2019.
We know that they arrive at around 9 p.m, and we know that it's just the three of them, and we know that they are interrupted at one point or joined at one point by Dominique, who is Dave's daughter. And we know that at one point, Dominique and Shamji leave the property together. And at 2:24, Zack fatally leaps to his death. He was captured by CCTV cameras mounted across the river on MI6 headquarters at Vauxhall Cross. And he is seen walking around the balcony and then essentially jumping. He leaps outwards by about 12 feet, narrowly misses the river or falls short of the river. His point of contact was a balustrade, the sort of divide between the Thames path and the river itself. He hits that and he falls to his death in the Thames. And we don't know what led him to do that. A pathologist, when examining his body, said that some of his injuries could not fully be explained by a fall alone. He landed on his hip, but he had a broken jaw. There were numerous details which didn't make sense or which were never fully examined by the police, which we'll come on to. But the long and short of it is, he jumped at 2:24 a.m. and really what has occupied me and of course my reporting and certainly Zack's parents since is why the police failed to get to the bottom of what happened in the face of some very sinister and troubling pieces of evidence.
Gabriel, you've been investigating the night that Zac Brettler was killed. Tell us what you've found that the police appear to have missed.
So there's a lot of evidence which suggests the possibility of there having been a major confrontation preceding Zack's decision to leap. Now, we've got these texts where Dave is saying he wants his money and where Shamji is saying this is going to be resolved one way or another. But there are other things, such as blood-like stains which were found on the walls of 2 rooms at this property. But the real focus of my investigation last week was on something which is an extraordinary piece of evidence. And it is a spreadsheet which, to a novice, looks unintelligible. But I ended up contacting the person who had created it. It's the data that was contained in a state-of-the-art tracking device that was installed in a red Mercedes rental vehicle that Shamji was driving before and after Zack's death. The police obtained a copy, essentially failed to analyse it in the level of detail that they could have done had they taken the time to understand it. And they accidentally sent it to Zack's parents, who gave it to me.
The police send a bit of evidence that they're looking at to the parents of the victim. That doesn't sound normal.
It's difficult to fully rationalise what the Met are doing in any given moment. In this instance, it was a case of incompetence. They meant to disclose something, a transcript of an interview, and ended up giving them this. But it turned out to be kind of a fortuitous mistake, because what we've learned from this information, essentially millions of bits of data. It is the latitude and longitude of the vehicle, the speed, the mode of the car, whether the speed limit's being exceeded, whether the ignition's being turned on and off. It is so much data. And I essentially spent a month or so trying to decode it. And
I was going to say, where do you begin with that? You've got a spreadsheet with an awful lot of data. How do you turn that into something that can tell you a story about the night?
I got lucky in that I managed to speak to a woman who worked for the company which produced the tracking device. And she gave me a glossary of terms and all kinds of information about what this data meant. And it allowed us to produce a sort of minute-by-minute reconstruction of what Shamji was doing on this night. I think the thing which, for me, changed the story was what Shamji did after leaving the flat and how that measures up against what he told police.
So we knew that Shamji, who had brought Zac Brettler to the flat, leaves with the daughter of Dave Sharma at about 1 a.m, we think.
That's right.
And we don't know what happens for the next hour or so, but somehow Zac ends up dead. What do you now know about what happened to Shamji after he left?
So Shamji is a prolific liar, and, I've read his interview transcripts in detail and examining some of the things he said, whether he himself can tell the difference between fiction and reality, because he lied just so much during his interviews. But at the very outset of the investigation, when actually Zac's body hadn't been identified and Zac was presumed missing, Shamji had told detectives that he had left the property at around midnight. That story evolved when interviewed under caution at Charing Cross Police Station once Zac's body had been identified. At that point, he said he left it around just after 1. And in both instances, he said he went straight home. That wasn't true. What this GPS data shows is around 1:30, he calls Dave, who's back up in the flat, gets no answer. And he's in his car, in the car park, and basically starts driving.
Yeah.
And he continues to try and get in touch with Dave. At 12 minutes past 2, he gets a call from Dave.
Oh.
That same minute, Shamji changes direction. Once this minute elapses, you could no longer say he was heading in a homeward direction. He surges down the Mall from Buckingham Palace to Trafalgar Square at 50 miles an hour. The speed limit's 20.
Wow.
Yeah, he rushes back to Riverwalk, arrives at 2:23 a.m. He's in reception, we think, at 2:24 a.m. That is the same minute that Zac jumps.
Wow.
There is this roughly 6 to 10 minute gap, which I've not been able to get down to the bottom of, between his arrival in reception and what he does next, which is he goes back up to the flat and he's in there alone with Indian Dave for 11 minutes. Now, when police asked him, because he told them I went back home, they did confront him with CCTV showing the opposite, that he went back up to the flat. And when asked about that, he said, I probably went down to have a cigarette and a walk around. He never mentioned this car journey. There's no mention of the fact he got into a car at all. And then he's asked what happened when you went back up. And he says, I went back and I saw Dave and Zac getting ready to go to bed. I saw them brushing their teeth and chatting. And we all had a hug, all three of us. And he seemed in a much better state than when I left.
Wow.
Notwithstanding the fact that Zac was dead by this stage. So that couldn't have been true. So he's there for 11 minutes. And then he heads downstairs and he goes down to the river and he peers into the body of water. You see CCTV. You can see that his phone flashes up at this point for reasons we don't know. And he's looking into the water and then he gets back to his car. He does next go back home to Mayfair. But at this point, this block of flats is north of the river. And to those who are not denizens of London listening, Mayfair is also north of the Thames. But to get back home, Shamji bizarrely drives over Vauxhall Bridge. He drives south to then come back up north. And this you see on GPS. What I wonder is whether at that point he was trying to get another vantage point on the river, because a coroner later ruled that when he walked down, he was looking for Zac. Naturally, none of which he ever told police.
I mean, it's incredibly fortuitous that those cameras at MI6 managed to catch all of this. Otherwise, there's so much we wouldn't know about that night. It's also incredibly lucky that you've managed to decode all of this information from this spreadsheet, because it doesn't sound like the police had. Just talk us through where you think this police investigation seems to have gone wrong.
Let's just briefly establish the facts of what happened. Zack dies in November 2019. The police have substantively conducted their investigation by October the following year. So they never sought to bring murder charges. They conducted a murder investigation, but they never tried to refer charges in relation to that crime. They did give the Crown Prosecution Service a file of evidence relating to Shamji perverting the course of justice. But this, the CPS said, didn't pass their test. It was inadequate, didn't pass their evidential threshold. And then in December 2020, something completely mad and unforeseen happened, which is Sharma, Indian Dave, I've been calling him in this podcast, he himself dies.
How does that happen?
Well, a great question to which we don't know the answer. So police quickly said it wasn't suspicious. They refused to merge it with the investigation into Zack's death. An inquest is still ongoing. So he died in December 2020. We're in April 2024.
Wow.
And we still don't have the truth as to why he died. Basically, the police investigation fizzled out. They examined the possibility that Zack committed suicide. They examined whether a murder happened. They essentially discontinued their inquiries after Sharma's death. And that meant that factual verdict was left to a coroner who delivered an open verdict, meaning that Zack's death was suspicious, but his cause was unknown. And since then, the parents have been trying to piece together what really did take place. And I think the more they've learned, the more they felt that police were at best conspicuously lacking in curiosity about certain pieces of evidence and information. And one of them is this spreadsheet, which, I've seen how they examined it. They produced a few pages. They used it to show that, Shamji was at this point at this time, but they never actually used it to create a sense of the journey that he took and how that journey interacted with key moments like the phone call he received. And the beauty of this evidence is you can actually establish whether it's correct or not in so far as we have independent pieces of evidence. But police just seem to have very quickly skated over it. And what is so agonizing, I'm sure, for Zack's parents, and what I feel looking at this myself is such a shame, is because they didn't do this analysis, they were never able to pin Shamji down on some of these details. But you can only imagine what he might have said if they had said, no, let's be very clear. Here is your journey. You took a call, and that same minute, you start speeding in the middle of the night at an extraordinary pace. Why? And I just wonder if he'd been confronted with those simple questions, what he might have said. But
it's a very different
the
thing.
reality is we'll never know. And he is now dividing his time between London, the Caribbean, and the west coast of the United States. And there are other things like their refusal to forensically test these blood-like stains, or there are these smear marks on the glass balcony perimeter that looked like somebody had wiped over something after Brettler had jumped. But we will just never know about why that happened because the police, it seems, didn't ask those questions.
What do the police say about this?
They are, predictably pretty defensive about it. They say they did a serious, lengthy investigation, that it was led by experienced detectives, and that, furthermore, there was a rigorous internal review, and that review found that the investigation had been appropriate. I went to them last week and confronted with them with some of these inconsistencies and errors that I think they made. And they said that we wouldn't be able to comment on whether errors were made until speaking to the relevant officer. But in the meantime, here's our general position on the matter.
So they haven't acknowledged yet that perhaps there might have been errors that they weren't aware of when they did that review.
That's correct. And then, they have, to be fair to the parents, given explanations or justifications for why they didn't do certain things. which, one might say pose more questions than answers. For instance, these blood-like smears. They said that they didn't test them because they had no information to suggest that they were suspicious.
Sharma, as you say, is dead. Have you been able to speak to Shamji? What does he say?
So I've been to Shamji, and the long and short of it is he's totally gone to ground. He is certainly not available for comment at this time, and we've given him a lot of opportunity to tell his side of this story.
And I know you've been talking to the parents, Zac Brettler's parents. How do they feel about what you found? And also for them, where does this end? What do they need to see happen?
I mean, Rochelle said something to me, which I quoted in our first piece, which I think is very moving and gets to the point of why they are asking these questions, which is that for them, finding out the truth of what happened is a way of dignifying their son's life. And yet, until they get to the truth, it will always feel like justice hasn't been done. They accept that Zack was troubled and was going through a difficult time, but they still, rightly recognise that doesn't mean that he deserved to die. And I think they are struggling, fighting for the truth, because that feels like the only option available to them, and is certainly, one way of honouring his tragically cut short life.
That was Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times. Today's producer was Edith Rousselot, the executive producer was Edward Drummond, and sound design was by Mal Lassetto. You can read all of Gabriel's reporting on Zac Brettler, as well as any updates on the story at thetimes.co.uk with a subscription. If you want to get in touch with us about anything you've heard on this episode, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.co.uk. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.